Lightning split the Wyoming sky the night Elias Crow found her, a woman in a wedding dress, alone in a storm that killed grown men. He should have ridden past, should have let the frontier handle her like it handled everything else. But something about the way she stood there, soaked and shaking but refusing to fall, made him stop. One decision, one abandoned bride. And suddenly, the man who swore off people was riding straight into hell with a stranger clinging to his back. He didn't know it yet, but that ride would cost him everything he thought he wanted, and give him the one thing he'd convinced himself he'd never have. If you're watching from somewhere out there in this wild world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it grabs you, hit that like button. Now let's see where this storm takes us. The storm came down like the end of the world. Elias Crow had seen bad weather before. Every man who worked the Wyoming frontier had. But this was different. This was the kind of storm that turned the landscape into something unrecognizable, where the line between earth and sky dissolved into sheets of rain so thick you couldn't see your own hands. Thunder rolled across the plains like artillery fire, and lightning cracked overhead in jagged white veins that left afterimages burned into your vision. He shouldn't have been out in it. Anyone with half a brain and basic survival instincts would have hunkered down hours ago, waiting it out in whatever shelter they could find. But Elias had been 3 hours from home when the first drops fell, and he'd gambled, wrongly as it turned out, that he could outrun it. Now he was paying the price. His horse, a sturdy roan mare named Rust, picked her way carefully through the mud, ears pinned back against the driving rain. Elias kept his head down, hat pulled low, one hand gripping the reins while the other clutched his coat closed against the wind that tried to peel it off his shoulders. Water ran down his neck in cold rivulets. His boots were soaked through. Every part of him that could be cold, and every part that could be wet was wet. He was focused on the ground ahead, watching for holes or loose rocks that could lame Rust and leave them both stranded when the lightning hit. It was close. So close the crack of thunder came simultaneously with the flash, a sound so loud it felt like a physical blow. Rust spooked, dancing sideways, and Elias had to fight to keep his seat. His vision was still full of white afterburn when he saw her. A figure, standing in the middle of the open plain, maybe 40 yards ahead. For a second, just a second, Elias thought he was seeing things. That the lightning had done something to his eyes, or that his brain was playing tricks on him, conjuring ghosts out of rain and exhaustion. Because what he was seeing didn't make sense. It was a woman, in a white dress. He blinked hard, wiping rain from his eyes with the back of his hand, and looked again. Still there. Not moving. Just standing in the storm like she'd grown up out of the mud. Christ, Elias muttered, and urged Rust forward. As they got closer, details emerged from the gray curtain of rain. The white dress wasn't just white. It was a wedding dress, or had been once. Now it was plastered to the woman's body, heavy with water, the fabric torn and stained with mud around the hem. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes around her face. She was shaking, whether from cold or fear or something else, Elias couldn't tell. But she wasn't running, wasn't seeking shelter, wasn't doing any of the things a person should be doing in a storm like this. She was just standing there, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. Elias pulled Rust to a stop about 10 feet away. Close enough to be heard over the rain, far enough to bolt if this turned out to be some kind of trap. He'd heard stories, men lured into ambushes by women in distress, robbed or killed or worse. The frontier was full of stories like that, and most of them were probably bullshit, but a man who'd survived out here as long as Elias had didn't take chances. "You lost?" he called out. The woman's head snapped up. Her eyes found his, dark eyes, wide with something that might have been relief or might have been terror, and for a moment she just stared at him like she couldn't quite believe he was real. Then she spoke, and her voice cut through the storm with a clarity that surprised him. "Are you him?" Elias frowned. "Am I who?" "Are you—" She took a shaky breath, seemed to gather herself. "Are you Thomas Whitfield?" "No." Something in her face crumbled. Not dramatically, she didn't fall apart or start crying, but something inside her seemed to collapse, like the last support beam holding up a condemned building. Her shoulders sagged. Her hands dropped to her sides. She looked down at the mud and didn't look back up. "Right," she said quietly. "Of course not." Elias sat there on rust, rain hammering down on both of them, and tried to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do. This wasn't his problem. This woman, whoever she was, whatever her story was, had nothing to do with him. He could turn around right now, right away, and never think about her again. That would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she was just standing there, not asking for help, not begging, just accepting whatever was about to happen. Like she'd already decided this was where her story ended, and she was too tired to argue with fate. Or maybe it was something else, something he couldn't quite name. A recognition. A sense that he was looking at someone who'd been pushed past their breaking point and was still, somehow, standing. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. She looked up at him again. "Waiting." "For who? This Thomas Whitfield?" A bitter smile ghosted across her face. "I was. But I don't think he's coming." "How long you been waiting?" "Since this morning. Maybe longer. I don't know anymore." Elias glanced at the sky. It was getting dark. Hard to tell if that was the storm or the approaching night. But either way, full darkness was maybe an hour off. Less if the storm didn't break. And the temperature was already dropping. He could see her shivering from here. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. "Someone expecting you?" "No." Her voice was flat, empty of everything except exhaustion. "No one's expecting me anywhere." Another crack of lightning split the sky, closer this time. Rust shifted nervously beneath him. Elias made a decision he already knew he'd regret. "Can't leave you out here," he said. "You'll die before morning." "I know." The way she said it, calm, matter-of-fact, like she was commenting on the weather, made something twist in Elias's chest. He'd seen a lot of things in his 34 years, most of them bad, but there was something about that quiet acceptance of death that hit different. "Got a cabin about 2 hours south," he said. "Not much, but it's dry and got a fire. You can wait out the storm there." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to decide if he was trustworthy or just another version of whatever hell she'd already been through. Finally, she nodded. "All right." Elias dismounted, landing in ankle-deep mud with a wet squelch. He was already soaked to the bone. What difference did a little more water make? He walked Rust over to where the woman stood, close enough now to see that she was younger than he'd first thought. Mid-20s, maybe. And despite the mud and the rain and the absolute wreck of her appearance, there was something about her face that suggested she'd been carefully raised, educated, probably came from money, which made what she was doing alone in the middle of Wyoming in a wedding dress even more confusing. "You know how to ride?" he asked. "I can manage?" "Good. Up you go." He helped her mount. She was lighter than he expected, or maybe just so cold and wet that she weighed less than she should, and then swung up behind her. It wasn't comfortable. Both of them on a horse meant for one, but comfort wasn't the priority right now. Survival was. "Hold on," Elias said, and kicked Rust into motion. They rode in silence for the first hour, pushing through the storm with heads down and determination serving as their only compass. The rain didn't let up. If anything, it got worse. Wind picking up from the north, driving the water almost horizontally, making it hard to breathe without inhaling half the storm. Elias kept Rust moving south, relying more on instinct and muscle memory than actual navigation. He'd made this ride 100 times in all kinds of weather. He could find his way home blind if he had to. The woman didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't complain, didn't make any sound at all except for the occasional sharp intake of breath when Rust stumbled or the wind hit particularly hard. Elias could feel her shivering against him, violent tremors that meant she was well past cold and sliding towards something more dangerous. Hypothermia. Shock. He needed to get her warm and dry, fast. "What's your name?" he asked, more to keep her conscious than out of any real curiosity. "Lillian." Her voice was barely audible over the storm. "Lillian Hart." "Elias Crow." "Thank you, Mr. Crow." "Haven't done anything yet." "You stopped. That's more than—" She paused, then finished quietly. "That's more than most would do." Elias didn't have an answer to that, so he just urged Rust onward. The cabin appeared out of the darkness like a ghost solidifying from mist, a low, rough structure of logs and mud chinkling, barely visible against the surrounding landscape. It wasn't much to look at even on a good day, and tonight, in the middle of a storm, it looked more like a pile of wet kindling than actual shelter. But it was home, and more importantly, it was dry. Elias dismounted first, then helped Lillian down. She could barely stand, her legs buckled when her feet hit the ground, and he had to catch her to keep her from falling face first into the mud. She was heavier now, waterlogged and exhausted, dead weight in his arms. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so." She couldn't. Not really, but she tried. Elias ended up half carrying her to the door while Rust followed behind, patient and long-suffering. He kicked the door open, it stuck in wet weather, swollen wood jamming against the frame, and pulled Lillian inside. The cabin was dark and cold, the fire long since gone to ash, but it was blessedly dry and out of the wind. Elias deposited Lillian in the single chair near the hearth and went to work with practiced efficiency. Fire first. Everything else could wait. He had kindling stored in a box near the fireplace, kept dry for exactly this kind of situation. Within minutes, he had flames crackling, small at first but growing steadily as he added larger pieces of wood. The light pushed back the darkness, and warmth began to creep into the room. Only then did he look at Lillian. She was in bad shape, worse than he'd realized outside, where the storm had hidden the worst of it. Her lips were blue. Her skin had a gray cast that spoke of serious cold exposure. The wedding dress, which might have been beautiful once, was destroyed, torn, stained, hanging off her in wet sheets that probably weighed as much as she did. "You need to get out of that dress," Elias said. Lillian's eyes flicked to him, a spark of something, wariness, maybe fear, cutting through the exhaustion. "I'm not—" Elias stopped, chose his words more carefully. "You're going to freeze if you stay in wet clothes. I've got some things that'll work. They won't fit right, but they're dry." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right." Elias went to the chest at the foot of his bed. His only bed, he realized with a sinking feeling, which was going to make tonight interesting, and pulled out a shirt and a pair of trousers. They'd be too big for her, but she could roll up the sleeves and legs. Better too big than soaking wet. "There's a screen over there," he said, gesturing to a corner where an old blanket hung on a line, creating a makeshift changing area he'd never actually used. "You can change behind that. I'll take care of the horse." He left before she could respond, stepping back out into the storm. Rust was waiting where he'd left her, patient as ever, despite being just as wet and miserable as the humans. Elias led her to the small lean-to that served as a stable, rubbed her down as best he could with a mostly dry cloth, and made sure she had water and feed. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes, and when he came back inside, Lillian was sitting by the fire in his two large clothes, her wet dress hanging over the back of the chair to dry. She looked different now, smaller somehow, without the volume of the dress. Younger, more vulnerable. Her hair was still wet, hanging loose around her shoulders, and her feet were bare. He hadn't thought to offer her socks, and he made a mental note to fix that. "Better?" he asked. "Much. Thank you." Elias nodded and set about making himself useful. He hung his own wet coat near the fire, changed into dry clothes of his own, and put a pot of water on to boil. He had coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute some people used, and some dried jerky that would do for food if they got hungry. Not much of a meal, but it would keep them going. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, rain hammered against the roof and walls, thunder rumbled in the distance, growing fainter now as the worst of the storm moved on. Elias made coffee, poured 2 cups, and handed one to Lillian. She took it with both hands, holding it close to her face, breathing in the steam. "So," Elias said finally, settling into a seat across from her on an upturned crate, "you want to tell me what you were doing out there, or is that none of my business?" Lillian was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee like it held answers she was trying to find. When she spoke, her voice was steady but tired, like she'd told this story before and was already sick of it. "I was supposed to get married today," she said. "To Thomas Whitfield. We'd been corresponding for 6 months. letters arranged through an agency. He was a rancher looking for a wife. I was... She paused, seemed to reconsider her words. I was looking for a new start. Mail-order bride, Elias said. It wasn't a question. Yes. No shame in her voice, no embarrassment, just fact. He sent money for the train ticket, told me exactly where to wait, what time he'd meet me. So I came out on the morning train, and I waited, and waited. The storm came in, and still no Thomas. Other people showed up for their meetings, left with whoever they were supposed to meet. Eventually, it was just me. She took a sip of coffee. I waited until I couldn't feel my feet anymore. Then I walked out into the field because I thought maybe I'd gotten the location wrong. Maybe he was waiting somewhere else. But there was no one. Just the storm. How long you been out here? In Wyoming, I mean. 3 days. Stayed in the boarding house in town the first 2 nights. Spent the last of my money this morning. Family back east? No. The word came out flat, final. No family. Elias absorbed that. A woman alone, no money, no connections, stranded in territory that ate people alive even when they had resources and support. And she'd just been left standing in a storm by a man who'd made promises he clearly never intended to keep. This Whitfield, Elias said carefully. You sure you got the right name, right meeting place? I'm sure. I checked the letters a dozen times before I got on the train. She set down her coffee cup, and when she looked at him, there was something hard in her eyes. He knew I was coming. He chose not to show up. Why would a man go through all that trouble just to leave you stranded? I don't know. Maybe he found someone else. Maybe he never intended to marry me in the first place. Maybe it was all some kind of... She stopped, jaw tightening. It doesn't matter why. He's not coming, and I'm here. Elias studied her across the firelight. She was putting up a good front, controlled, rational, keeping her emotions locked down tight. But he could see the cracks, the way her hands shook slightly when she wasn't holding the coffee cup, the tension in her shoulders, the fact that she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. What were you planning to do? He asked. Out there in the storm, if I hadn't come along? Lillian was quiet for a long time. When she answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know. Wait until I couldn't wait anymore, I suppose. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Elias had suspected as much. You didn't stand in a killing storm in a wedding dress unless you'd given up on other options. But hearing it confirmed was different. Well, he said after a moment, you're here now. Storm's passing. We'll figure out what comes next in the morning. There's nothing to figure out. I have no money, no prospects, and nowhere to go. In the morning, I'll be exactly where I was today, stranded. She said it without self-pity, just cold assessment of her situation. You could go back east. On what money? With what reputation? She shook her head. A woman who travels west as a mail-order bride and comes back alone? You know what people would say, what they'd assume. I'd be ruined before I stepped off the train. She was right, and they both knew it. The frontier was supposed to be a place where people could reinvent themselves, start fresh, leave behind whatever they'd been before. But it was also brutal in its judgments, especially of women. An abandoned bride had no value, no status, no protection. She'd be seen as damaged goods at best, a cautionary tale at worst. So, what's your plan? Elias asked. I don't have one. Lillian looked at him directly for the first time since they'd started talking, and there was something fierce in her expression despite the exhaustion. I came west because I had nothing left to lose. That's still true. So I'll figure something out, or I won't. Either way, it's my problem, not yours. You've already done more than enough by bringing me here. Elias didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about all the reasons he should keep his mouth shut, let her leave in the morning, wash his hands of this whole situation. He'd spent the last 5 years building a life that was simple, solitary, and safe. No complications, no attachments, no one depending on him or him depending on them. It was lonely sometimes, sure, but lonely was better than the alternative. Lonely didn't hurt you. But he was also thinking about the way she'd looked standing in that storm, soaked and shaking but refusing to fall. about the steadiness in her voice even now when she had every reason to fall apart, about the fact that she'd thanked him for stopping, as if basic human decency was something to be grateful for rather than expected. He was thinking that maybe, just this once, the smart thing and the right thing weren't the same. "You could stay here," he heard himself say. Lillian blinked. "What?" "Stay here. Work the homestead. I could use an extra pair of hands, and you need somewhere to be." Even as he said it, part of his brain was screaming at him to stop talking, to take it back, to not invite this kind of trouble into his carefully ordered life. But he kept going anyway. "Temporary arrangement, just until you figure out what you want to do next, or until spring, whichever comes first. You don't even know me." "No, but I know you're not afraid of hard work. Anyone who'd travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger isn't looking for easy. And I know you're practical enough to weigh your options without drama." He gestured around the cabin. "It's not much. One room, basic facilities. You'd have to sleep by the fire until I can rig up something more private. Work would be dawn to dusk, probably harder than anything you've done before. But you'd have food, shelter, and time to figure out your next move." "Why would you do this?" Lillian asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. "What do you get out of it?" "Help with the homestead. Someone to cook and clean while I'm working the land." He paused, then added honestly, "And maybe I'm tired of talking to my horse." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, the first real expression he'd seen from her that wasn't exhaustion or carefully controlled despair. "I don't know anything about homesteading," she said. "You'll learn. Most people who come out here don't know anything at first. They figure it out or they leave. And if I can't figure it out, then you leave. No hard feelings, no obligations." Elias leaned back, trying to look more casual about this than he felt. "Look, I'm not trying to trap you or take advantage. You need help. I'm offering it. Simple as that. You want to say no and take your chances in town. That's your right. But the offer stands." Lillian was quiet, thinking it over. Elias could almost see her mind working, weighing risks and benefits, trying to find the catch. There wasn't one, at least not the kind she was probably imagining. He wasn't looking for a wife or a woman to warm his bed or any of the things a man alone might want from a woman in her position. He was just offering her the same thing he'd want if their situations were reversed. A chance. "All right," she said finally. "Until spring, or until I find something better. Fair enough?" They shook on it, her hand small and cold in his, and Elias tried not to think about what he'd just agreed to. What it would mean to have another person in this space, disrupting his routines, requiring his attention, forcing him to be something other than alone. He'd figure it out, just like everything else. The storm finally broke around midnight, the rain tapering off to a drizzle and then stopping altogether. Elias gave Lillian the bed. There was no argument about it. She needed real rest more than he did, and made himself a pallet by the fire with a bedroll and a couple of old blankets. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd slept in worse places. He lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of Lillian's breathing evening out as she fell asleep, and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. He'd saved her life tonight. That part was simple, straightforward, the kind of thing any decent person would do. But inviting her to stay? Offering her work and shelter with someone who was essentially a stranger? That was complicated. That was the kind of decision that could change everything, for better or worse. Elias had learned a long time ago that change usually meant worse, but it was too late now. The offer was made, the agreement was struck, and come morning his life of careful solitude would have a new variable to account for. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing it would be a long time coming. Oh, when Elias woke, gray dawn light was seeping through the gaps in the shutters, and the cabin smelled like coffee. He sat up, disoriented for a moment. He always woke to silence and cold, the fire dead from the night before, nothing moving except himself. But this morning was different. This morning there was warmth and the sound of movement and the rich smell of something brewing. Lillian was awake, dressed in his borrowed clothes with the sleeves and pant legs rolled up, feeding wood into the fire. The coffee pot was already on, steam rising from the spout. She'd also found his store of cornmeal and was mixing something in a bowl, Johnny cakes probably, which meant she'd found the salt and the lard too. She glanced over when she heard him moving. "Morning." "Morning," Elias replied, his voice rough from sleep. "You didn't have to." "I know, but I was awake, and you were asleep, and it seemed like a good use of time." She went back to mixing. "I hope you don't mind. I took the liberty of looking through your stores to see what you had." "No, that's fine." It was strange, watching someone else move around his space. Strange, but not unpleasant. The cabin felt different with her in it. Smaller, maybe, but also more alive. More like a home, and less like just a place to sleep between days of work. Elias got up, rolled up his bedding, and splashed cold water on his face from the basin near the door. By the time he was done, Lillian had Johnny cakes cooking on a griddle over the fire, and coffee poured into 2 cups. They ate in comfortable silence, too hungry and too focused on the food to bother with conversation. The Johnny cakes were good, better than the ones Elias made for himself, which was a low bar, but still. When they were done, Lillian cleaned up without being asked, washing the dishes in the basin and setting them to dry. "So," she said when she was finished, "what do we do first?" Elias had been thinking about that. There was plenty of work to do. There was always plenty of work on a homestead, but he needed to figure out what Lillian could actually handle. She'd said she didn't know anything about homesteading, and he believed her. That meant starting with basics. "First, I show you around," he said. "You need to know the layout, where everything is, what's what. Then we'll start with something simple, probably the garden. It needs weeding, and that's work that won't kill you if you do it wrong." "All right." They spent the morning on the tour. Elias showed her the lean-to where Rust lived, the small chicken coop that currently held 4 scraggly hens, the well where they drew water, the vegetable garden that was more weeds than vegetables at this point, and the small shed where he kept tools and supplies. He explained his routines, when he fed the animals, how he maintained the property, what needed to be done daily versus weekly versus whenever he got around to it. Lillian asked good questions. Not stupid questions about things she should know, but practical ones about specific tasks and how they connected to each other. She was clearly trying to build a mental map of how everything worked, and Elias found himself appreciating her approach. She wasn't afraid to admit ignorance, but she also wasn't helpless. By midday, they were in the garden, pulling weeds under a sky that had cleared to pale blue. The storm might never have happened except for the mud and the puddles still standing in the low spots. Lillian worked steadily. No complaints, though Elias could see her struggling with some of the more stubborn weeds. Her hands weren't used to this kind of work. They were soft, uncalloused, the hands of someone who'd lived an easier life. But she didn't quit. She just kept pulling, kept moving down the row, even when her fingers started to blister. "You should probably stop," Elias said around mid-afternoon, when he noticed her wincing every time she gripped a new weed. "Don't want to wreck your hands on the first day." "I'm fine." "You're bleeding." Lillian looked down at her hands, seeming surprised to see blood on her palms where the blisters had popped. "Oh, I didn't notice." "Come on, that's enough for today." He led her back to the cabin, made her wash her hands, and found some old strips of cloth to wrap around the worst of the blisters. She sat quietly while he worked, not pulling away even though he knew it had to hurt. "You did good today," Elias said when he was done. "Better than most people would on their first try. I made it halfway down 1 row. And you didn't quit. That counts for something." Lillian looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. "Thank you. For this. All of it." Elias shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You're working for it. No thanks needed." But as he went back outside to finish the work she'd started, he found himself thinking that maybe this arrangement wouldn't be the disaster he'd been expecting. Maybe it would actually work out. It was a dangerous thought, and he knew it, but he couldn't quite make himself stop thinking it anyway. The days fell into a rhythm that surprised both of them with how quickly it felt normal. Lillian woke before dawn each morning, started the fire, and had coffee ready by the time Elias rolled out of his bedding. They'd eat whatever passed for breakfast, usually cornmeal mush or leftover Johnny cakes, and then split up to tackle the day's work. Elias handled the heavier tasks, the ones that required strength or skill she didn't have yet. Lillian took everything else, and there was plenty of everything else. The cabin had been neglected in ways that became obvious once someone actually looked at it with fresh eyes. Dust in corners that hadn't been swept in months, clothes that needed mending, shelves that needed organizing, tools that needed cleaning and proper storage. Elias had been living like a man alone so long he'd stopped noticing the slow decay of order into chaos. Lillian noticed, and she fixed it. By the end of the first week, the cabin looked different. Not fancy, not decorated, but clean, organized. The kind of space where you could find what you needed without hunting through 3 different piles. Elias didn't say anything about it, didn't want to make it weird, but he appreciated it more than he'd expected. The work outside was harder for her. The garden was just the beginning. There were chickens to feed, eggs to collect, water to haul from the well, wood to chop and stack. Every task had its own small complexities, its own ways of going wrong, and Lillian encountered most of them that first week. She dropped a full bucket of water halfway between the well and the cabin, soaking herself and wasting 20 minutes of work. She got pecked by the meanest of the 4 hens, a vicious little bird Elias called Scratch, and bled all over the egg basket. She nearly chopped her own foot off trying to split kindling and had to sit down for 10 minutes afterward, shaking. But she didn't quit, didn't complain. Just bandaged whatever was bleeding, dried off whatever was wet, and went back to work. Elias watched this process with a kind of reluctant respect. He'd seen plenty of people come west with grand ideas about frontier life, only to fall apart when they realized how hard it actually was. Most of them were gone within a month. But Lillian wasn't most people. She had something stubborn in her, something that refused to break even when breaking would have been easier. On the 8th day, she spoke the first words that weren't strictly about work or survival. They were sitting outside after dinner, beans and salt pork, nothing special, watching the sun go down. It was the first evening warm enough to sit comfortably, and Elias had dragged out a couple of crates to serve as seats. Lillian sat with her bandaged hands resting in her lap, looking out at the land that stretched away in all directions. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," she said. Elias glanced at her. "What is?" "Everything, the sky, the space, back east, everything feels closed in. Buildings, streets, people everywhere. But out here," she trailed off, searching for words. "Out here it feels like you could walk forever and never hit a wall." "You could," Elias said, "if you had enough water and didn't mind dying of exposure." She smiled slightly. "I suppose that's the catch, isn't it? All this freedom, but it'll kill you if you're not careful." "That's one way to look at it." They sat in silence for a while. A hawk circled overhead, hunting for its own dinner. The chickens had already put themselves to bed in the coop, and Rust was grazing in the small paddock Elias had fenced off. Everything was quiet except for the wind moving through the grass. "Can I ask you something?" Lillian said. "Sure. Why do you live out here? Alone, I mean. There are towns, settlements, places with other people." Elias considered the question. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him that, but it had been a long time since he'd bothered to answer honestly. "Tried living around people," he said finally. "Didn't take." "What does that mean?" "Means I'm better off on my own." Lillian looked at him with those dark, searching eyes. "That's not really an answer." "It's the only one you're getting." She accepted that without pushing, which he appreciated. Some people couldn't leave well enough alone, had to dig and prod until they hit something that hurt. But Lillian seemed to understand that everyone out here had their reasons, and not all of those reasons were meant to be shared. "What about you?" Elias asked, turning it back on her. "You said you came west because you had nothing left to lose. What happened to make that true?" Lillian was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured, like she was picking through a minefield of memories. "My parents died when I was night in fever. I was living with my aunt after that, helping with her household. She was kind enough, but it was always clear I was an obligation, not family. When she died 2 years ago, the house went to her son. He made it very clear I wasn't welcome to stay." "No inheritance?" "Nothing that mattered. A few pieces of jewelry, some dresses. I sold what I could and lived on it for a while, but it doesn't last long when you have no skills anyone will pay for." "You could have found work." "As what?" "I can read and write and manage a household, but so can half the women in any city. The ones who'll work for less because they're not pretending to be something they're not." She looked down at her bandaged hands. "I tried for 6 months, applied to be a governess, a companion, a shop clerk. No one wanted me. Too educated for some positions, not connected enough for others. Wrong everything. So you became a mail-order bride. It seemed practical. A man who needed a wife, a woman who needed security. Simple transaction. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I was so careful about it. Read his letters over and over, looking for warning signs. Asked questions about the property, his background, what kind of life we'd have. He had answers for everything. Seemed honest, seemed real. And then he didn't show up. And then he didn't show up, Lillian agreed. I keep wondering what I missed, what I should have seen that would have told me he was never serious. But I can't figure it out. Either he was an excellent liar, or I was exactly as naive as everyone probably thinks. Elias didn't have a good answer to that. He'd never understood people who played games with other people's lives like that. Making promises you had no intention of keeping, leaving someone stranded just because you could. It was cruel in a way that felt worse than simple violence. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think you're naive. I think you made the best choice you could with the information you had. Sometimes that's not enough, but it's all anyone can do. Lillian looked at him, something shifting in her expression. That's kind of you to say. Not kind, just true. The sun had set completely now, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Elias stood, stretching muscles that were sore from a day spent mending fence posts. We should get inside. Early start tomorrow. What's tomorrow? Teaching you to shoot. Lillian blinked. I'm sorry, what? You're living out here now. You need to know how to handle a gun. Not negotiable. I've never... Which is why we're starting tomorrow. Elias headed for the cabin door. Get some sleep. You'll need it. Behind him, he heard Lillian mutter something that sounded like, Lord help me, but he pretended not to hear. The next morning, after the chores were done and the sun was high enough to see properly, Elias brought out his rifle and 2 boxes of ammunition. Lillian looked at the weapon like it might bite her. It's not going to hurt you if you handle it right, Elias said. That's not particularly reassuring. Wasn't meant to be. Come on. He led her out to a flat stretch of land about 50 yards from the cabin, where he'd set up a series of targets. Old tin cans balanced on fence posts, a piece of wood with a crude circle painted on it, a stuffed sack hanging from a tree branch. Nothing fancy, but it would serve. First rule, Elias said, holding the rifle so she could see. Never point this at anything you don't intend to shoot. Not at yourself, not at me, not at the ground between us. You keep it pointed down range at all times. Understand? Yes. Second rule. Treat every gun like it's loaded, even when you know it's not. That's how accidents happen. People get careless, make assumptions. All right. He went through the basics, how to hold it, how to aim, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger instead of pulling. Lillian listened with the same intense focus she brought to everything, asking questions when she didn't understand, nodding when she did. Then he handed her the rifle. She took it gingerly, like it was made of glass, and Elias had to resist the urge to roll his eyes. It's not going to explode. Hold it like you mean it. Lillian adjusted her grip, settling the stock against her shoulder the way he'd shown her. She looked awkward, uncertain, her whole body tense. Relax, Elias said. You're fighting yourself. The gun's not the enemy. Easy for you to say. Just breathe. Line up the sight with that can on the left post. Take your time. Lillian did as instructed, squinting down the barrel. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard, harder than she was expecting, clearly, and the shot went wide, missing the can by a solid 2 feet. Lillian stumbled back a step, and Elias caught her elbow to steady her. You flinched, he said. It's loud. It's supposed to be loud. That's how you know it's working. He repositioned her, adjusted her stance. Try again. This time, don't anticipate the kick. Just let it happen. She tried again and again and again. By the 10th shot, she'd managed to hit the fence post, though not the can on top of it. By the 20th, she'd knocked a can off, and the look of surprised pride on her face made Elias smile despite himself. Better, he said. That was terrible. That was better than most people do their first time. You'll get there. They practiced for another hour before Elias called it. Lillian's shoulder was going to be bruised. He could already see her favoring it, and there was no point in overdoing it on day one. She needed to build up strength and confidence gradually, not all at once. As they walked back to the cabin, Lillian carrying the rifle with more confidence than she'd had that morning, she asked, "Do you really think I'll need this? To shoot something, I mean." "Hope not," Elias said. "But hoping's not the same as planning. Out here, you need to be able to protect yourself. Could be an animal, could be a person. Either way, I'd rather you know how to handle it than freeze up when it matters." "Have you ever had to shoot someone?" The question caught him off guard. Most people didn't ask that directly. "Once," he said after a pause. "What happened?" "I shot him." Lillian waited, clearly expecting more, but Elias didn't elaborate. That story belonged to a version of himself he didn't like thinking about, let alone sharing. She seemed to sense that and dropped it. The days continued their pattern: work, meals, sleep, repeat. But something was shifting between them, slow and almost imperceptible. They were getting comfortable with each other in a way that felt both natural and dangerous. Elias caught himself watching her sometimes when she didn't know he was looking. The way she'd tuck a strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The small, satisfied sound she made when she finally got a stubborn task done right. The fact that she hummed while she cooked, nothing recognizable, just notes strung together. He told himself it didn't mean anything. She was just there, that was all. When you lived with someone, you noticed things. It was inevitable. But then there were moments that felt like something more. Like the afternoon she came back from collecting eggs with her apron full of wildflowers she'd picked along the way. She arranged them in a tin cup on the table, bright splashes of color in the otherwise plain cabin. And when Elias asked why, she just shrugged and said, "Why not?" He didn't have an answer to that. Or the evening he came in from working on the fence line to find her mending one of his shirts, the one with the ripped sleeve he'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. She didn't ask if she could, didn't make a production of it, just did it, like it was the most natural thing in the world to take care of his things. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know, but it needed doing, and I was sitting anyway." Simple, practical. And somehow it made his chest feel tight in a way he didn't know how to name. 3 weeks in, a traveling merchant came through. Elias heard the wagon before he saw it, the creak of wheels, the jingle of harnesses, and walked out to meet it. The merchant was an older man named Bill Carver, someone Elias had traded with before. Good prices, decent goods, no questions about why a man might be living alone in the middle of nowhere. But Bill's eyebrows went up when he saw Lillian step out of the cabin behind Elias. "Well now," Bill said, grinning. "When'd you get yourself a wife, Crow?" "She's not my wife," Elias said flatly. "She's working the homestead." "Uh-huh." Bill's grin didn't falter. "Sure she is." Lillian stepped forward before Elias could say anything else. "What are you selling, Mr. Carver?" "Bill Carver. And I've got a little bit of everything, ma'am. Dry goods, fabric, tools, whatever you might need." They spent the next half hour going through Bill's inventory. Elias bought ammunition, coffee, and a new knife to replace the one he'd broken last month. Lillian hesitated over a bolt of fabric, plain blue cotton, nothing fancy, and Elias saw her fingers brush against it before she pulled her hand back. "How much for the fabric?" he asked Bill. $2 for the whole bolt." "We'll take it." Lillian looked at him sharply. "Elias, I can't. You need clothes that fit," he said. "Consider it part of your wages." She looked like she wanted to argue, but Bill was already cutting the fabric and wrapping it, and the moment passed. When Bill drove off an hour later, Lillian stood there holding the wrapped bolt against her chest, not quite meeting Elias's eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's just fabric." "It's not, though, is it?" Elias didn't answer that because he didn't know how. She was right. It wasn't just fabric, it was a statement, a commitment, an acknowledgement that this arrangement was more than temporary convenience. But saying that out loud felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit, so he just shrugged and went back to work. That night, Lillian stayed up late cutting the fabric by lamplight, using one of Elias's old shirts as a rough pattern. He watched her work from his bedding by the fire, the way she frowned in concentration, checking and rechecking her measurements. She was making herself a shirt, he realized. Something that would actually fit her instead of hanging off her frame like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. "You know how to sew?" he asked. "My aunt taught me. Said every woman should know how to make her own clothes, in case she ever needed to." Lillian held up the cut pieces, examining them critically. "I was never very good at the decorative parts, but I can manage basic construction." "Seems like she taught you a lot of practical things." "She did. I don't think she meant to prepare me for this exact situation, but it's working out that way." Lillian set down the fabric and looked at him. "Do you ever think about what your life would be like if you'd made different choices? Turned left instead of right somewhere along the way?" "Sometimes. Doesn't change anything, though." "No, I suppose not. But I wonder anyway." She picked up the fabric again, started pinning pieces together. "I wonder what would have happened if I'd never answered Thomas Whitfield's advertisement. If I'd stayed in the city, kept looking for work. Would I have found something? Or would I have ended up in a worse place than this?" "You think this is a bad place?" "No. That's the strange part. I thought it would be working for a stranger in the middle of nowhere, doing work I never imagined doing. But it's not. It's just different." She paused, needle hovering over fabric. "Is that odd? That I don't hate this?" Elias thought about that. "No, I don't think it's odd." "What would you call it then?" "Adaptation. You're good at it, better than most." Lillian smiled, small and genuine. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in years." "Then people haven't been paying attention." The words came out before Elias could stop them, and he saw Lillian's hand still on her sewing. For a moment, the air between them felt charged with something neither of them seemed ready to name. Then she ducked her head, focusing intently on her stitching, and the moment passed. But it lingered. In the quiet spaces between tasks, in the way they'd started sitting a little closer during meals, in the fact that Elias found himself making excuses to stay near the cabin instead of working the far fields. He was in trouble, and he knew it. The realization hit him fully one morning when he woke to find Lillian already up, standing at the cabin's single window with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise. She'd made the shirt she'd been working on, and it actually fit her. Still made from his fabric, still clearly rough sewn, but unmistakably hers. Her hair was tied back with a piece of string, and there was something about the set of her shoulders, the calm way she stood there, that made his breath catch. She looked like she belonged here, and that terrified him, because belonging meant staying, and staying meant he'd get used to having her around, and getting used to her meant it would hurt when she left. And she would leave, eventually. This was always meant to be temporary. Come spring, she'd figure out her next move, find somewhere better, someone better. He'd known that from the start, but knowing it and accepting it were turning out to be very different things. "You're up early," Lillian said without turning around, somehow sensing he was awake. "Could say the same about you." "Couldn't sleep, kept thinking." "About what?" She turned to face him then, backlit by the early light, expression unreadable. "About Thomas Whitfield." That was not what Elias had expected. Something cold settled in his stomach. "What about him?" "I want to know why. Why he sent for me, promised me a future, and then just didn't show up. It's been eating at me." She set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "I think I need to confront him, get answers." "That's a bad idea." "Maybe, but I need to do it anyway." Elias sat up, fully awake now. "Lillian, listen to me. Men who do what he did, they're not going to suddenly develop a conscience and explain themselves. You're more likely to get hurt than you are to get closure." "I don't care. I need to try." "Why? What difference does it make now? You're here, you're safe, you're building something. Why go back to that?" "Because I can't move forward until I understand what happened. Don't you see? Every time I think about staying here, about making this work, I think about him, about what he did, why he did it, what it means about me. And I can't—" Her voice cracked slightly. "I can't live like that. Always wondering, always questioning whether I missed something obvious, whether I'm making the same mistake again." The implication of that last part hit Elias like a physical blow. She was talking about them, about whatever was growing between them in the quiet spaces of this homestead. She couldn't trust it, couldn't trust him, until she dealt with the ghost of Thomas Whitfield. "All right," he heard himself say. Then we'll go find him. We? You think I'm letting you ride out there alone? To confront a man who already proved he can't be trusted? Elias stood, started pulling on his boots. We'll go together. Get your answers, and then we leave. Deal? Lillian looked at him for a long moment, something vulnerable and grateful in her expression. Deal. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Elias asked around, discreetly, and found out that Thomas Whitfield owned a large ranch about 20 miles west. Big operation, lots of cattle, more money than sense, according to the gossip. The kind of man who could afford to play games with people's lives and never face consequences. The ride out would take most of a day, maybe longer depending on conditions. They'd need supplies, and a good excuse if anyone asked what they were doing. Elias settled on saying they were looking into buying livestock, which was plausible enough not to raise questions. He didn't sleep well that night, kept thinking about what they might find at that ranch, what Whitfield might say or do, kept thinking about the look on Lillian's face when she'd said she needed answers before she could move forward. She was right, probably, but that didn't make it easier to swallow. They left at first light 2 days later. Russ carried them both again, Lillian seated in front of Elias this time, his arms bracketing her as he held the reins. It was more intimate than their first ride through the storm, but also more familiar. They'd gotten used to each other's presence, the way their bodies moved together. The land opened up before them, vast and rolling. They passed other homesteads, small settlements, stretches of nothing punctuated by everything. Lillian was quiet for most of the ride, tense in a way she hadn't been in weeks. Whatever bravado had driven her to demand this confrontation was wearing thin now that it was actually happening. You don't have to do this, Elias said at one point. We can turn around, go home. Home, Lillian repeated softly. Is that what the cabin is now? Elias didn't answer, because he didn't trust what might come out if he did. The Whitfield Ranch appeared in the late afternoon, sprawling across a valley like a small kingdom. Big house, multiple outbuildings, corrals full of horses and cattle. The kind of spread that took serious money to build and maintain. Elias felt his jaw tighten looking at it. This was what Whitfield had offered Lillian. This wealth, this security, this visible proof of success. And he'd just not shown up. Left her standing in the rain like she meant nothing. They rode up to the main house, and a hand came out to meet them. Young guy, maybe 20, with the kind of swagger that came from working for someone important. Help you folks? He asked. Looking for Thomas Whitfield, Elias said. He around? Might be. What's your business? Personal. Just need a few minutes of his time. The hand looked them over, taking in Elias's worn clothes and hard expression, Lillian's obvious tension, and shrugged. Wait here. He disappeared into the house. They waited. Lillian's breathing had gone shallow, quick. Elias could feel her heart racing through the back of her shirt. Breathe, he murmured. Whatever happens, we leave together. Remember that. She nodded, but didn't speak. The hand came back out, followed by a man in his 30s. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of face that probably photographed well. Handsome in a calculated way. He looked at them with polite confusion, and then his eyes landed on Lillian, and something changed. Recognition. And then something else. Annoyance, maybe. Or guilt wearing an annoyed mask. Lillian Hart, Thomas Whitfield said, and his voice was smooth, educated, completely devoid of shame. I wasn't expecting to see you again. Lillian slid off the horse, stood on the ground in her rough clothes and work boots, and met his gaze head on. No, I imagine you weren't. Whitfield's expression shifted into something that might have passed for regret if you didn't look too closely. But Elias was looking closely, and what he saw was a man working through calculations, trying to figure out the best way to handle an inconvenience. I apologize for the confusion, Whitfield said, his tone suggesting this was all just a minor misunderstanding. There was a change in circumstances that I should have communicated better. A change in circumstances, Lillian repeated, her voice flat. Is that what you're calling it? Perhaps we should discuss this inside, away from... He gestured vaguely at the ranch hand who was still standing nearby, clearly interested in the drama unfolding. No, Lillian said. We'll discuss it right here. I think I've earned that much, don't you? After traveling halfway across the country on your promise, spending the last of my money to wait for you in the rain. Whitfield's jaw tightened, the first crack in his smooth facade. Miss Hart, I understand you're upset, but there's no need to make a scene. I'm not making a scene, I'm asking a question. Why didn't you come? You sent for me. You paid for my ticket. You told me exactly where and when to meet you, and then you just didn't show up. Why? Elias stayed on Rust, watching this play out. Part of him wanted to get down, stand beside Lillian, make it clear she wasn't alone. But another part knew this was her moment, her confrontation. She needed to face this herself. Whitfield glanced at the ranch hand. Davis, go check on the north fence line. Boss, I just came from… Now. Davis left, shooting one last curious look over his shoulder. When he was gone, Whitfield turned back to Lillian, and some of the false warmth left his expression. You want the truth? He asked. That would be refreshing. Fine. My business partner's daughter arrived 2 weeks before you were scheduled to come. Margaret. I'd known her since we were children, and her father suggested, strongly suggested, that a marriage between our families would be beneficial for both our businesses. Lillian stood very still. So you chose her instead. It was a practical decision. Margaret brings connections, capital, an established name. You would have brought… He stopped himself, but the damage was done. Nothing, Lillian finished for him. I would have brought nothing except myself. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Her voice was steady, but Elias could see her hands clenched at her sides, knuckles white. You made a business calculation. I was an option, she was an investment, and when the better investment came along, you took it. That's not entirely fair. Fair? For the first time, heat crept into Lillian's tone. You want to talk about fair? You left me stranded in a town where I knew no one, with no money and no way back. You couldn't even be bothered to send a message, let someone know you'd changed your mind. I stood in that storm for hours, Thomas. Hours. Because I thought you were a man who kept his word. I'm sorry you were inconvenienced. Inconvenienced, Lillian laughed, sharp and bitter. I nearly died. If this man… She gestured back at Elias without looking at him. If Elias hadn't found me, I would have frozen to death in that field wearing a wedding dress meant for you. An inconvenience would have been a delayed train. What you did was abandonment. Whitfield's face hardened. What would you have had me do? Break a contract with one of the most influential families in the territory? Damage my reputation and my business over a woman I'd never even met? I would have had you tell me the truth. Send a telegram, write a letter, hell, send someone to the meeting point to explain. Anything except leaving me there like I was nothing. You're being unreasonable. Am I? Lillian took a step closer, and Whitfield actually stepped back. Tell me something, Thomas. Did you ever intend to marry me? Or was I always just a backup plan in case something better didn't come along? The silence that followed was answer enough. Lillian's expression didn't change, but something inside her seemed to settle, like a piece finally clicking into place. Right. Well, at least now I know. She turned to go, and that's when Elias saw the woman. She'd come out of the house while they were talking, young, pretty, dressed in expensive clothes that probably cost more than Elias made in 6 months. Her blonde hair was perfectly arranged, her hands soft and uncalloused. She stood on the porch watching them with curious, calculating eyes. Thomas? She called out. Is everything all right? Fine, Margaret. Just some business to clear up. Margaret's gaze moved from Whitfield to Lillian, taking in the rough clothes, the work boots, the sun-darkened skin and calloused hands. Her expression shifted into something that might have been pity if it wasn't so laced with superiority. Oh, she said, understanding dawning. You're her, the one from before. Lillian stopped, turned back. Excuse me? Thomas told me about you. The arrangement he'd made before we… Well, Margaret smiled, sweet and poisonous. I'm sure you understand. These things happen. These things, Lillian repeated slowly. It must have been difficult for you, coming all this way only to find the position was already filled. Margaret descended the porch steps, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never had to fight for anything in her life. But really, you should be grateful. You wouldn't have been happy here. This life requires a certain breeding, a certain understanding of how things work in society. Someone like you would have been lost. Elias saw Lillian's spine straighten, saw the dangerous stillness that came over her. He'd seen that stillness before, in men right before they threw a punch. Someone like me, Lillian said quietly. I don't mean to be unkind, but facts are facts. Thomas needs a wife who can help him build this empire, who understands business and politics, not someone who... She gestured vaguely at Lillian's appearance. Well, you can see the difference yourself, I'm sure. For a moment, Elias thought Lillian might actually hit her. Her hands had curled into fists, her whole body vibrating with barely controlled anger. But then something changed. The tension drained out of her, replaced by something colder, sharper. You're right, Lillian said. I can see the difference. You're standing here in your expensive dress, in this big house, thinking you've won something. Thinking you're better than me because you have money and connections and the right last name. She took a step closer, and Margaret's smile faltered. But here's what you don't see. I've survived things you can't even imagine. I've rebuilt myself from nothing, twice over. I've worked until my hands bled and gotten up the next day to do it again. And I did it all without anyone's help, anyone's money, anyone's name. That's very impressive, I'm sure, but I'm not finished. Lillian's voice cut through Margaret's attempted interruption like a knife. You think you're building an empire with Thomas. Maybe you are. But it's built on his family's money and your father's connections. What happens when that money runs out? When those connections dry up? Do you know how to survive on your own? Because I do. I know exactly what I'm worth, and it has nothing to do with what anyone else thinks of me. Margaret's face had gone pale, spots of color high on her cheeks. How dare you, sir? I dare, because I have nothing left to lose. You took the life I was promised, the security I was counting on. And you know what? I'm grateful, because if I'd married him, she looked at Whitfield with something like contempt. I would have spent the rest of my life wondering if I was good enough, if I measured up. If the next better option came along, would he trade me in too? She turned back to Margaret. So enjoy your empire, Mrs. Whitfield. I hope it's everything you think it is. I hope you never have to find out what you're made of without it. Lillian walked back to where Elias sat on Rust, and he reached down to help her mount. She swung up behind him this time, her hands settling on his waist, and he could feel her shaking, not with fear or sadness, but with adrenaline and anger and something that felt like triumph. Wait, Whitfield said, and there was something in his voice Elias hadn't heard before. Uncertainty. Lillian, I am sorry. Truly, you deserved better than what I gave you. Lillian looked at him over her shoulder. Yes, I did, but I found it anyway. No thanks to you. Elias turned Rust and they rode away from the Whitfield ranch without looking back. Neither of them spoke for the first mile, and Elias didn't push. He could feel the tension in Lillian's body. The way her breathing was still too fast, too shallow. Finally, about 2 miles out, she made a sound, something between a laugh and a sob. Are you all right? Elias asked. I don't know. Ask me in an hour. Her hands tightened on his waist. Did that really just happen? Did I really say all that? You did. I called her out, in front of her husband, in front of their house. You did? Oh, God. Lillian pressed her forehead against his back. What was I thinking? You were thinking she deserved it, and she did. She's going to hate me. Probably. But you're never going to see her again, so what does it matter? Lillian was quiet for a moment. Then, I meant what I said. About being grateful. Is that awful? Should I not feel that way? Elias thought about that. No, I don't think it's awful. I think you saw what your life would have been like with him, and you realized you dodged something worse than a bullet. A life of always wondering if I was enough, if I measured up, if he'd leave me the second someone better came along. She shuddered. You're right. That would have been worse. They rode in silence for a while longer. The sun was getting low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They'd need to find somewhere to camp for the night. It was too far to make it back to the cabin before dark, and riding in the dark was a good way to get hurt. Elias found a spot near a creek, sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. Not perfect, but it would do. They dismounted, and he set about making camp while Lillian tended to Rust. The routine was familiar now, comfortable. They worked together without needing to discuss who did what. By the time full dark fell, they had a fire going and were sitting beside it eating jerky and hardtack. Not much of a dinner, but neither of them had brought supplies for anything more elaborate. "Can I ask you something?" Lillian said after a while. "Sure." "Back there, when Margaret was talking, you looked like you wanted to intervene. Why didn't you?" Elias poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks drift upward. "Because it wasn't my fight. You needed to face them yourself, say what you needed to say. If I'd stepped in, it would have taken that away from you. Even when she was being cruel? Even then, you didn't need me to defend you. You did fine on your own." He glanced at her. "Better than fine, actually. I think you might have scared her a little." Lillian smiled, small and satisfied. "Good." They fell quiet again, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant murmur of the creek. Elias found himself studying Lillian in the firelight, the way it highlighted the curve of her cheek, the determined set of her jaw. She looked different than the woman he'd found in the storm. Harder in some ways, but also more solid, more real. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, catching him looking. Elias hesitated. The truth was dangerous territory, but lying felt worse. "I was thinking you've changed since that first night." "How?" "You're less breakable. That first night, you looked like one more bad thing would shatter you completely. Now you look like you could take on the whole territory and come out ahead." Lillian considered that. "I had to change. Staying the person I was, that wasn't going to work out here. So I became someone else. Someone stronger." "You were always strong. You just didn't know it yet." She looked at him with those dark, searching eyes. "You say things like that sometimes. Things that sound simple but aren't. Do you even realize you're doing it?" "Doing what?" "Making me feel like I matter, like what I think and do and say has value." She looked away into the fire. "Thomas made me feel like an option, a backup plan. You make me feel like—" She stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. "Like I'm the plan. The only one that matters." Elias's chest tightened. They were treading into territory he'd been avoiding, and he knew he should change the subject, redirect, pull back. But he didn't want to. For once, he didn't want to be careful. "You are," he said quietly. "The only one that matters, I mean." Lillian's head snapped up. "What?" "You asked me once why I live alone. I told you I tried living around people and it didn't take." He set down the stick he'd been using to poke the fire. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The real reason is that people leave. They die, they move on, they find something better. And every time that happens, it tears a piece out of you. Eventually, you decide it's easier to be alone than to keep losing pieces. But then you showed up, and I thought, fine, temporary arrangement. Help her out, she helps me out. Come spring, we both move on. No attachments, no complications. Simple. And now? Now I don't want you to leave. The words came out raw, honest, more vulnerable than anything he'd said in years. I know that wasn't the deal. I know you're supposed to figure out your next move and go, but the thought of you leaving, of waking up one morning and you're just gone. He stopped, jaw tight. It's worse than anything else I can think of. Lillian stared at him, something complex and unreadable in her expression. Elias, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. Needed to be honest about what this is for me. He forced himself to look at her. What you are for me. For a long moment, Lillian didn't move, didn't speak. Then she shifted closer, closing the distance between them on their makeshift seats by the fire. What if I told you, she said carefully, that I don't want to leave either? That somewhere in the last few weeks, your cabin stopped being temporary shelter and started feeling like the first real home I've had in years. Elias's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. Then I'd ask what you want to do about that. I don't know. This is complicated. We barely know each other. What we have, what we're building, it's not exactly conventional. Nothing out here is conventional. That's the whole point. True. Lillian reached out and her hand found his. Her fingers were rough now, calloused from work, but her touch was gentle. I'm scared. Of what? Of this. Of trusting it. Of trusting you. She met his eyes. Thomas taught me that promises don't mean anything, that people will say one thing and do another. How do I know you won't? I'm not him. I know. Logically, I know that. But my heart doesn't care about logic. My heart just knows that the last time I trusted someone, it nearly destroyed me. Elias turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. I can't promise I'll never hurt you. I can't promise this will be easy or perfect or any of the things you probably deserve, but I can promise I'll be honest with you. I won't make commitments I don't intend to keep, and I won't leave you standing in the rain. Lillian's breath caught, and he saw tears shine in her eyes before she blinked them back. That's more than I thought I'd ever get again. Is it enough? She was quiet for a long moment, and Elias felt the weight of everything hanging on her answer. Then she squeezed his hand. I think it might be. But I need time. Time to be sure this is real and not just, I don't know, survival instinct or gratitude or two people who found each other in a storm and decided to keep finding each other every day after, Elias finished. Yeah, that. She smiled, small and uncertain. Is that crazy? Probably, but I'm willing to try if you are. I am, but slowly. Can we do this slowly? We can do this however you need to do it. Lillian nodded, seemed to relax slightly. They sat there by the fire, hands still linked, and Elias felt something shift between them. Not resolved, exactly, but acknowledged, named, made real in a way it hadn't been before. So what happens now? Lillian asked. Now we sleep. Tomorrow we ride home. And then, Elias paused, thinking. Then I build you a proper room. Something with walls and a door and privacy. Can't have you sleeping by the fire forever. You don't have to do that. I want to. Besides, if we're doing this, whatever this is, we need to do it right. That means giving you your own space. Elias Crow, are you being a gentleman? Don't spread it around. I've got a reputation to maintain. She laughed, and the sound of it did something to him he didn't have words for. They stayed up a while longer, talking about nothing important, just filling the space between them with words and presence. When they finally bedded down for the night, Elias on one side of the fire, Lillian on the other, a careful distance maintained, he found himself staring up at the stars, thinking about how different everything felt from just 6 hours ago. This morning, Lillian had been chasing ghosts, trying to make sense of what Thomas Whitfield had done to her. Tonight, she'd faced those ghosts and walked away from them on her own terms. And somehow, in the process, they'd both admitted things that changed the shape of what they were to each other. Elias didn't know what happened next. Didn't know if this fragile thing between them would hold or if it would fall apart the first time things got hard. But for the first time in 5 years, he wanted to find out. Wanted to take the risk. That was terrifying, but it was also something else. It was hope. They made it back to the cabin by late afternoon the next day. The ride was quiet but comfortable, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they finally dismounted in front of the cabin, Lillian stood there for a moment, just looking at it. What? Elias asked. It looks different, or maybe I'm seeing it different. I don't know. She turned to him. When we left yesterday, I wasn't sure I'd want to come back. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Good, because I've got work for you. She laughed. Of course you do. The days that followed fell into their familiar pattern, but with an undercurrent of something new. They were careful with each other, testing boundaries, figuring out what this new version of their relationship looked like. Elias started building the room he'd promised, a small addition to the cabin, nothing fancy but private. Lillian helped when she could, learning how to handle tools, how to measure and cut and fit pieces together. They talked more. About small things and big things and everything in between. Lillian told him about growing up back east, about her parents and her aunt, and the life she'd left behind. Elias shared pieces of his own past, carefully edited but honest. Where he'd come from, why he'd left, what he was running from when he came west. And slowly, day by day, the walls between them came down. It was Lillian who brought it up first, about a week after they'd returned from confronting Whitfield. They were sitting outside after dinner, watching the sunset, and she turned to him with an expression that was half nervous, half determined. "I've been thinking," she said. About? About what you said. By the fire that night. About not wanting me to leave." Elias's pulse quickened. "Yeah? The thing is, I don't want to leave either, but I also don't want to just drift along, waiting to see what happens. I need—" She paused, searching for words. "I need something solid, something I can count on." "What do you want, Lillian?" She looked at him directly. "I want to know if you meant it, when you said I was the only one that mattered, because if you did, if this is real for you too, then I think we should make it official." Elias felt his breath stop. Official. Marriage. A real one, not like what Thomas was offering, a partnership, equal partners building something together. She held up a hand before he could respond. "I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other in some ways, but I also know I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in years. And I know that what we have here, what we're building, it's worth fighting for, worth committing to." "You're asking me to marry you." "I am, and before you answer, I need you to understand something. If you say yes, I'm all in. No backup plans, no exit strategies, just you and me and this homestead and whatever comes next. But I need to know you're all in too. I can't do halfway, Elias. Not again." Elias looked at her, this woman who'd shown up in his life during a storm, who'd survived being abandoned and rebuilt herself into something stronger, who made his cabin feel like a home just by being in it. He thought about all the reasons he should say no, all the ways this could go wrong, all the scars he carried from the last time he'd let someone get close. And then he thought about waking up every morning to find her already there, coffee brewing and flowers on the table, about the way she hummed while she worked, about the strength in her hands and the fire in her eyes when she'd face down the people who'd hurt her. He thought about what his life would look like without her in it, and the answer was simple: empty. "Yes," he said. Lillian blinked. "Yes?" "Yes, I'll marry you. Equal partners. All in. No halfway." He reached out, took her hand. "I meant what I said that night. You're the only one that matters. And if you're willing to take a chance on a stubborn homesteader with more baggage than sense, then I'm willing to spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice." She kissed him then, quick and fierce and sweet. And Elias felt something in his chest crack open, something he'd kept locked down for so long he'd forgotten it was there. When they pulled apart, Lillian was smiling. "So, how do we do this? There's a circuit preacher who comes through about once a month. We could wait for him, make it legal and proper. Or we could do it ourselves. Right here, right now. Just us and the land and whatever promises we want to make to each other." Lillian looked around at the homestead, at the cabin with its half-built addition, at the garden and the chicken coop and the vast sky above. "I like that better. Official papers can come later. This feels more real." So they did it. Standing there as the sun set and the first stars appeared, they made promises to each other. Simple ones, honest ones. Promises about partnership and honesty and facing whatever came next together. No preacher, no witnesses, no legal document, just two people choosing each other in the face of everything that had tried to keep them apart. When it was done, Elias pulled Lillian close, and she fit against him like she'd always belonged there. "So," he said. "Mrs. Crow." "So," she echoed. "Mr. Crow." "What now?" She looked up at him, eyes bright in the fading light. "Now we build a life. Together." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias believed that was actually possible. The morning after their makeshift wedding, Elias woke to the sound of hammering. He sat up, disoriented for a moment, then realized Lillian wasn't inside. He pulled on his boots and stepped out to find her already at work on the room addition, measuring boards with the careful concentration she brought to everything she did. "You're up early," he said. She glanced over, a smile tugging at her lips. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I might as well make myself useful. That's supposed to be my project." "It's our project now. That's how this works, right? Partners?" Elias felt something warm settle in his chest. "Yeah, that's how it works." They spent the morning working side by side, and by afternoon the frame was up. It wasn't much yet. Just bones, really, but it was progress. Lillian stepped back to survey their work, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "It's going to be good," she said. "When it's finished, I mean. A real room. Better than sleeping by the fire. I don't know." The fire had its charm. She glanced at him, something playful in her expression. "But I suppose having walls will be nice too." That night they ate dinner outside again. It was becoming their routine, this quiet time after the work was done, sitting together while the day faded into night. But tonight felt different. Everything felt different, actually. There was a lightness between them that hadn't been there before, a sense of possibility that made even the simplest moments feel significant. "Tell me something," Lillian said, breaking a comfortable silence. "What do you want? I mean long term. What does success look like for this place?" Elias thought about that. He'd spent so long just surviving, just making it from one season to the next, that he'd stopped thinking about actual goals. More land eventually. Enough to run cattle properly, not just the few head I've got now. Maybe hire help when we can afford it. Build this place into something that lasts. He paused. "What about you? What do you want?" "Honestly, I want exactly what we're doing. Building something from nothing. Making a home that's ours, not something we inherited or fell into. I want to wake up every morning knowing I earned this, that we both did." She looked at him. "Is that enough? Just wanting this?" "It's more than enough." But Lillian's question stuck with him over the next few days. What did he want? And more importantly, what did they want together? It was one thing to survive, another thing entirely to build something worth surviving for. He started making plans. Real plans. Not just vague ideas about someday. He sketched out where they could expand the homestead, calculated how much it would cost to buy more livestock, thought about crops that might do well in this soil. When he showed Lillian his notes, she studied them with the same intensity she brought to everything. "This is good," she said, "but we need income now, not just plans for later. What can we do in the short term? Chickens are laying well. We could sell eggs in town." "That's something. What else?" "I've been thinking about the garden. If we expand it, plant more variety, we could sell produce. Won't make us rich, but it's steady money if we work it right." Lillian nodded slowly. "I could do preserves, jams, pickles, things that keep. People pay good money for quality preserves." "You know how to do that? My aunt taught me. I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I can manage." She pointed at his sketches. "Show me where you're thinking for the expanded garden." They spent the next hour bent over his rough drawings, refining plans, arguing good-naturedly about details. It felt right, this partnership. Not just romantic, but practical. They challenged each other, pushed each other, made each other's ideas better. A week later, Bill Carver came through again on his traveling merchant route. This time, when he saw Lillian, his eyebrows went up even higher than before. "Well, well," he said, grinning. "Looks like things have changed since I was here last." "We got married," Lillian said simply. "Did you now? And when was this happy occasion?" "Last week. Private ceremony." Bill looked between them, still grinning. "Private ceremony. Right. Well, congratulations to you both. Didn't think I'd see the day Elias Crow settled down, but I'm glad I was wrong." "Thanks, Bill," Elias said, cutting off what was sure to be a longer speech. "What have you got for us today?" They bought supplies. More seeds for the garden expansion, canning jars for Lillian's preserves, extra ammunition, coffee. Bill threw in a small mirror as a wedding present, which made Lillian laugh. "What's a homestead without a mirror?" Bill said. "Lady needs to see herself looking pretty." After he left, Lillian hung the mirror inside the cabin, positioning it to catch the morning light. It was a small thing, but it changed the space, made it feel more permanent, more like a home where people actually lived instead of just survived. The days fell into a new rhythm. They worked hard, harder than before actually, because now they were building towards something specific. The garden expanded, row by row. Lillian started her preserves operation, filling the cabin with the smell of cooking fruit and vinegar. Elias finished the room addition, and Lillian moved her things in with an expression that looked suspiciously like relief. Not that I didn't appreciate the fire, she said, arranging her few possessions on the shelf Elias had built. But having a door that closes is going to be nice. Privacy, Elias agreed. Exactly. She turned to face him. Although, now that we're actually married, we could… She stopped, suddenly uncertain. Elias felt heat creep up his neck. They'd been careful since their makeshift ceremony, maintaining a respectful distance. But she was right. They were married now by any definition that mattered. The rest of it, the physical part of marriage, that was something they hadn't really discussed. We could, he said. If you want. No pressure. I just… Lillian sat down on the edge of the bed frame Elias had built. No mattress yet, just boards. I don't want it to be another thing we're doing because it's expected. I want it to be because we choose it, because we're ready. Are you? Ready, I mean. She looked at him for a long moment. I think so, but I'm also scared. What if it changes things? What if we get this part wrong and it ruins what we have? Elias sat down beside her, their shoulders touching. Then we figure it out. Same way we figured out everything else. Together. You make it sound simple. It is simple. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's simple. He took her hand. We take it slow. We talk about it. And if either of us needs to stop or slow down or just wait, we do that. We do. No shame, no judgment, just honest. Lillian leaned against him and he felt some of the tension leave her body. Okay. Slow sounds good. So they took it slow. And over the next few weeks, their marriage became real in all the ways it hadn't been before. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments and fumbling attempts and times when they both had to stop and laugh at themselves. But it was theirs, built on the same foundation of honesty and partnership that defined everything else between them. By the time autumn arrived, turning the grass golden and putting a bite in the morning air, they'd settled into something that felt like it might actually last. The homestead was thriving in small but measurable ways. The expanded garden produced more than they could use, and Lillian's preserves sold well in town. They'd bought 2 more chickens and a rooster, and the flock was healthy. Elias had traded work with a neighbor for 3 young heifers, the beginning of a proper cattle operation. They were building something, slowly, carefully, but building nonetheless. Then the circuit preacher came through. Elias hadn't been expecting him. The preacher's schedule was irregular at best, but there he was one afternoon, riding up on a tired-looking mule with his Bible in his saddlebag. Elias Crow, the preacher said, dismounting with a groan. Been a while. Reverend Pike, what brings you out this way? The usual, saving souls, performing marriages, burying the dead, whatever the frontier requires. Pike's eyes landed on Lillian, who'd come out of the cabin at the sound of voices. And who might this be? My wife, Lillian Crow. Pike's eyebrows went up. Wife? Well now, when did this happen? Few weeks back. And who performed the ceremony? Elias and Lillian exchanged a glance. We did, Lillian said. Just us. Private. Pike frowned, the kind of frown that suggested theological complications. I see. Well, that's all well and good for the 2 of you, but in the eyes of the law and the church, you're going to need something more official. Can't have you living in sin, even unintentional sin. We're not living in sin, Lillian said, an edge creeping into her voice. We're married. We made promises to each other. That makes it real. I'm not saying it doesn't count in your hearts, Mrs. Crow, but the law requires documentation, witnesses, a proper ceremony. Otherwise, you've got no legal protections, no rights to each other's property if something happens. Pike softened his tone. I'm not trying to diminish what you've built here. I'm trying to help you protect it. Elias could see Lillian's jaw tighten. She didn't like being told their marriage wasn't legitimate, and honestly, neither did he. But Pike had a point. If something happened to one of them, if there was ever a legal question about the property or their rights, having nothing in writing could cause serious problems. What do you suggest? Elias asked. Let me marry you, properly. I can file the paperwork when I get back to the county seat, make it all legal and official. Won't change what you have between you, but it'll give you the protections you need. Lillian looked at Elias. What do you think? I think he's probably right. Won't hurt to have it on paper. Fine. Lillian turned to Pike. When? Now's as good a time as any. You got any neighbors who could serve as witnesses? They didn't, not really. The nearest homestead was miles away, and Elias wasn't close with any of them anyway. But Pike said he could serve as both officiant and witness if they signed statements affirming they were entering into the marriage willingly. So that's what they did. Standing in front of the cabin they'd built together, with the homestead spreading out around them and Rust grazing peacefully in the background, they repeated the vows Pike gave them. Standard words, traditional words, nothing like the personal promises they'd made to each other under the stars. But when Pike pronounced them husband and wife and told Elias he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared felt just as real as anything that had come before. There, Pike said, producing a marriage certificate from his bag and filling it out with careful handwriting. Now you're legal. Congratulations. They fed Pike dinner and let him sleep in the lean-to with Rust before he rode out the next morning. After he left, Lillian looked at the marriage certificate, now signed and official. Feels different, having it written down, she said. Better or worse? Just different, more permanent maybe. She folded the certificate carefully and put it in the chest where they kept important things. I suppose we're really married now. We were really married before. I know. But now everyone else will believe it too. The comment stuck with Elias. It hadn't occurred to him that people might question their marriage, but of course they would. A woman shows up out of nowhere, starts living with a man who'd been alone for years, claims they're married? Without proof, without witnesses. That looked like something else entirely. Something that could damage Lillian's reputation, make their life harder than it needed to be. Maybe Pike had done them a favor after all. October brought the first real cold snap. Elias woke one morning to frost on the windows and his breath visible in the air. Winter was coming, and they needed to be ready. He'd been through 4 winters on this homestead, and each one had been brutal. The isolation, the cold, the constant struggle to keep warm and fed and sane. But this year felt different. This year, he wasn't facing it alone. They spent the next few weeks preparing, chopping and stacking wood until they had enough to last through the worst months. Winterizing the cabin, stuffing rags into gaps, checking the roof for leaks, making sure the door sealed properly. Bringing in the last of the garden harvest and storing everything that could be stored. Lillian worked on her preserves with increased urgency, processing everything they couldn't eat fresh. By the time the first snow fell in early November, they were as ready as they could be. The first storm was mild, just a few inches that melted within days. But Elias knew better than to relax. The real storms would come later, in January and February, when the wind howled across the plains and the cold could kill you in minutes if you weren't careful. He was checking the fence line one afternoon in late November when Russ threw a shoe. It happened sometimes, just bad luck, but it meant a trip to town for the blacksmith. Elias could shoe a horse himself in a pinch, but he didn't have the right tools, and with winter coming, he couldn't afford to do a half-assed job. I'll ride in tomorrow, he told Lillian that evening. Get her reshod, pick up a few things we're running low on. Should be back by nightfall. I'll come with you. You don't have to. It's a long ride for not much payoff. I know, but I could sell some preserves while we're there. And I want to see the town, get a feel for the people. If we're going to be selling there regularly, I should know who I'm dealing with. She had a point. Lillian had been to town exactly once since arriving, and that was the day she'd been abandoned. Time for her to reclaim that space, make it less about what had happened and more about what came next. They left at dawn the next day, Lillian riding behind Elias on Rust, a sack of preserves tied securely behind them. The ride was cold but clear, and they made good time. Town was bustling when they arrived, more people than Elias had seen in one place in months. While he took Rust to the blacksmith, Lillian set up at the general store. The owner, a shrewd woman named Mrs. Chen, examined Lillian's preserves with the critical eye of someone who knew quality when she saw it. These are good, Mrs. Chen said, surprising both of them. Better than most of the slop people try to sell me. I'll take 6 jars on consignment. If they sell, bring me more. Thank you, Lillian said, and Elias could hear the pride in her voice. By the time he finished with the blacksmith and met her back at the store, Lillian had already sold 2 jars directly to customers who'd been browsing. She was glowing with success, more animated than he'd seen her in days. "This could work," she said as they prepared to ride home. "If I can keep up production, Mrs. Chen says she'll buy everything I can make." And at the prices she's suggesting, that's real money, Elias, not getting by money, actually improving our situation money. "Then we'll make it work." The ride home was good, both of them energized by the day's success. They made plans, calculated costs and profits, talked about what they could do with the extra income. More livestock, better tools, maybe even hiring help come spring. But when they were about a mile from the homestead, Russ stumbled. Elias reined her in immediately, dismounted to check her legs. The new shoe was fine, but her right foreleg was swollen just above the fetlock. Not badly, but enough to notice. "Damn," he muttered. "What's wrong?" She strained something. Probably happened when she stumbled. Nothing serious, but she needs rest. They walked the rest of the way home, leading Rust slowly, Elias watching for any signs the injury was worse than it looked. By the time they reached the cabin, full dark had fallen and the temperature had dropped significantly. Over the next few days, Rust recovered but stayed tender on that leg. Elias kept her confined, giving her time to heal properly, which meant he was grounded too, at least for heavy work that required riding. The far fence line he'd been planning to check would have to wait. The supply run he'd been considering would have to wait. Everything that required leaving the immediate area of the homestead would have to wait. It was frustrating but manageable. They had enough of everything to last a few weeks, and Rust would be fine with rest. Just bad timing, that was all. Then the second storm hit. It came in fast and hard, a wall of white that turned the world into a confusion of wind and snow. Elias had just enough warning to get the animals secured before visibility dropped to nothing. He fought his way back to the cabin, ice already forming on his beard, and barely managed to force the door closed against the wind. "Is it bad?" Lillian asked, her face pale in the firelight. "Bad enough. We're staying inside until it passes." The storm raged for 2 days. Snow piled up against the cabin walls, and the wind screamed through every gap they hadn't managed to seal. They kept the fire burning constantly, rationing wood to make sure they didn't run out, and huddled together for warmth when the temperature inside dropped despite their best efforts. On the third day, the storm finally broke. Elias forced the door open against a 4-foot drift and stepped out into a transformed landscape. Everything was white, pristine, and absolutely still. Beautiful in its way, but also dangerous. The animals would need digging out, supplies would need checking, damage would need assessing. He was halfway to the lean-to when he realized something was wrong. The roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. Not completely, the main support beam was still holding, but enough that the whole structure was unstable, and Rust was inside. "Lillian!" he shouted back toward the cabin. "I need help!" She came running, took one look at the situation, and grabbed a shovel without being told. They worked frantically to clear the snow from the collapsed section, afraid that any minute the rest of the roof would come down. Rust was panicking, wild-eyed and snorting, unable to understand what was happening, but smart enough to know it was bad. "We need to get her out," Elias said. "Now, before the rest comes down." "How? She's trapped in the corner." "I'll go in, lead her out. You keep clearing snow, give us room to move." "Elias, that's insane. If it collapses while you're in there, then it collapses. But I'm not leaving her to die." He didn't wait for Lillian to argue further. He slipped through the partially blocked entrance, moving carefully to avoid jostling the damaged structure. Russ saw him and calmed slightly, recognizing safety even in the middle of chaos. "Easy, girl," Elias murmured, reaching for her lead rope. "We're getting you out of here." He led her forward slowly, every step measured, aware that the whole thing could come crashing down with the wrong move. Behind him, he could hear Lillian still digging, clearing the path. The roof creaked ominously, and Rust balked. "Come on," Elias urged. "You can do this, just a little further." They were almost clear when it happened. The main support beam, weakened by the weight and the damage, finally gave way. Elias heard it crack, felt the structure shudder, and had just enough time to shove Rust forward toward the opening before the whole thing came down. Pain exploded across his back and left side as timber and snow crashed onto him. He went down hard, pinned under the debris, unable to move or breathe or do anything except register that this was very bad. "Elias!" Lillian's voice sharp with terror. He tried to answer, couldn't. Everything hurt, his ribs especially. Broken, probably. Maybe worse. He could feel warmth spreading down his side, which meant blood, which meant something had cut deep. Then Lillian was there, digging with her bare hands, throwing aside boards and snow with strength he didn't know she had. She cleared his head first, and he sucked in a painful breath, the relief of air mixing with the agony of his injuries. "Don't move," she commanded. "I'm getting you out." It took her almost an hour. Working alone, moving carefully to avoid causing more damage, she excavated him piece by piece. When she finally pulled him free and dragged him back to the cabin, Elias was barely conscious, blood soaking through his shirt from a gash across his ribs where a timber had caught him. Lillian got him inside onto the bed and started stripping off his clothes to assess the damage. Her hands were shaking but steady enough to work, and her face had gone pale but determined. "How bad?" Elias managed to ask. "Bad enough. Broken ribs for sure. This cut needs stitching, and you might have internal bleeding, I can't tell." She met his eyes. "I need to clean this and sew it up. It's going to hurt. Just do it." She did. Using a needle and thread she sterilized in boiling water, working by lamplight because the day had grown dark, Lillian stitched the gash closed with careful, painful stitches. Elias gritted his teeth and tried not to pass out. When she was done, she wrapped his ribs with strips torn from a spare shirt, tight enough to support them, but not so tight he couldn't breathe. "You need a doctor," she said. "Can't get to one. Storm's still too fresh, roads will be impassable, and Russ can't carry me even if they weren't." "Then what do we do?" "We wait. Keep me warm, keep the wound clean, hope infection doesn't set in." He caught her hand. "You're going to have to handle things for a while. The animals, the homestead, all of it. Can you do that?" Lillian looked at him, and he saw fear in her eyes. Real fear, the kind that came from understanding exactly how precarious their situation was. But beneath that fear was something harder, something that refused to break. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." And she did. The first few days were the hardest. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, fever setting in despite Lillian's best efforts to keep the wound clean. She changed his bandages twice a day, forced water and broth down his throat when he could swallow, and sat beside him through the worst of it, monitoring his breathing, watching for signs that the internal bleeding was getting worse. But she also kept the homestead running. She woke before dawn every morning, stoked the fire, and went out into the brutal cold to tend the animals. Rust was skittish after the collapse, but Lillian talked to her in low, steady tones until the mare calmed enough to accept food and water. The chickens needed their coop cleared of snow, their water unfrozen, their feed distributed. The heifers needed hay and checking over for frostbite or injury. All of it fell on Lillian's shoulders, and she carried it without complaint. On the fourth day, Elias woke to find her sitting at the table, her head in her hands, shoulders shaking. He tried to sit up, pain shooting through his ribs, and managed to get himself halfway upright before she heard him and turned. Her face was wet with tears, but she wiped them away quickly, almost angrily. "You're awake," she said, her voice rough. "How long was I out?" "Most of the day. Your fever broke this morning." She stood, came to the bedside, pressed her hand to his forehead to check. "Still warm, but better than it was." "You've been crying." "I'm fine." "Lillian." She sat down on the edge of the bed, and for a moment she just looked at him. Then the words came out in a rush. "I thought you were going to die. That first night, when the fever spiked, I thought I was going to lose you, and I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't know how to run this place alone, wouldn't know how to survive winter by myself, wouldn't know how to—" Her voice broke. "And I was angry at you for going into that lean-to, for risking yourself for a horse, for making me face the possibility of being alone again. But then I realized that's exactly why I love you, because you don't leave things behind. You don't abandon what matters, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs you." Elias reached for her hand, his movement slow and painful. "I'm still here." "I know, and I'm going to make sure you stay that way." She squeezed his hand. "But you need to understand something. I'm not the same woman you found in that storm. I'm not going to fall apart if things get hard. I'm going to fight. I'm going to do whatever it takes to keep us both alive and keep this homestead running. You got that?" "Yeah, I got that." Good. She stood, all business again. Now you need to eat something, real food, not just broth. You've lost too much weight already. Over the next week, Elias's strength slowly returned. The fever stayed away, the wound began to heal, and his ribs hurt less with each passing day. He still couldn't do heavy work, could barely get out of bed without help at first. But he could think clearly again, could give Lillian advice about things she wasn't sure how to handle. And what he saw impressed the hell out of him. She'd reorganized the work schedule to maximize efficiency, handling the most critical task first and letting less urgent things wait. She'd figured out a system for keeping the water supply from freezing completely, using hot rocks from the fire wrapped in cloth and placed in the buckets overnight. She'd even started repairs on the lean-to, dragging lumber from the woodpile and shoring up the damaged section well enough to keep the worst of the weather out. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Elias asked one afternoon, watching her work through the window. "I didn't, I just figured it out as I went." She came inside, stamping snow from her boots. "Probably not doing it right, but it's holding for now." "It's more than holding. You're doing better than I did my first winter out here." "I had a good teacher." "I barely taught you anything." "You taught me everything that matters. How to think through a problem, how to prioritize, how to keep going when everything feels impossible." She sat down beside the bed. "I've been thinking about what you said before, about building something that lasts. I think I understand now what that means. It's not just about the land or the livestock or how much money we make. It's about proving we can survive anything, together. Even this. Especially this." By mid-December, Elias was back on his feet. Not at full strength, his ribs still ached, and he tired more easily than before, but functional. He could handle light chores, could think through problems without the fog of fever and pain clouding his judgment. And he could see clearly just how much Lillian had accomplished while he'd been laid up. The homestead hadn't just survived, it had continued to function, even to thrive in small ways. The animals were healthy, the supplies were holding out, and Lillian had even managed to make another batch of preserves using the last of their stored fruit, planning ahead for the spring selling season. "You didn't need me," Elias said one evening as they sat by the fire. Lillian looked up from the socks she was mending. "What?" "All this time I've been thinking I was helping you, teaching you how to survive out here. But you didn't need me to teach you anything. You already had it in you, you just needed a chance to prove it." "That's not true. I needed you, I still need you." She set down her mending. "But not because I can't survive alone. I can. We both know that now. I need you because I don't want to survive alone. There's a difference." "Yeah, there is." She came over to where he sat, settled herself beside him carefully, mindful of his still healing ribs. "Do you remember what I said that night by the fire, after we confronted Thomas?" "You said a lot of things." "I said I was scared of trusting this, of trusting you, of believing this was real and not just survival instinct." She looked at him. "I'm not scared anymore. I know what this is now. I know what we are." "What are we?" "Partners, real ones. The kind who see each other at their worst and don't run. The kind who carry each other when carrying is needed and stand beside each other when it's not." She smiled. "The kind who build something worth fighting for and then fight like hell to keep it." Elias pulled her closer, ignoring the twinge in his ribs. "I love you. Should have said it before, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Lillian Crow. Not because you saved my life, though you did. Not because you kept this place running, though you did that too. I love you because you're the strongest person I've ever met, and the kindest, and the only one I want beside me when the next storm hits." "The next storm," Lillian repeated, laughing softly. "Always planning for disaster. That's frontier life." "I suppose it is." She kissed him, gentle and careful. "I love you too, in case that wasn't obvious." It was, but it's good to hear it anyway. Winter continued its assault through January and into February, but they were ready for it, more than ready. They'd proven they could handle whatever the territory threw at them, separately and together. And that knowledge changed something fundamental in how they approached each day. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, planning, building toward a future that felt real and solid and achievable. When Bill Carver came through in early March, He found them working together on a new chicken coop, laughing about something as they hammered boards into place. "Well now," Bill said, grinning as he climbed down from his wagon, "you two look like you've had an eventful winter." "You could say that," Elias agreed. Bill's eyes went to the rebuilt lean-to, the expanded garden plot they'd marked out for spring planting, the new coop taking shape. "Business must be good." "Good enough," Lillian said. "We've got preserves to sell if you're buying. Always buying quality goods. Let's see what you've got." They did brisk business with Bill that afternoon. He took all of Lillian's remaining preserves, bought some eggs, and sold them seeds for the spring planting at a fair price. Before he left, he pulled Elias aside. "I heard about the accident," Bill said quietly. "Heard you got hurt pretty bad. News travels fast. Always does. Also heard your wife kept this place running single-handed while you recovered." Bill glanced over at Lillian, who was organizing the seeds they'd bought. "That's not easy. Most people couldn't have managed it." "She's not most people." "No, she's not. You're a lucky man, Elias Crow." "I know." After Bill left, Elias and Lillian stood looking at the homestead spread out around them, the cabin with its addition, the rebuilt lean-to, the garden plot ready for spring, the chickens pecking around the coop, Rust grazing peacefully, her leg fully healed, all of it hard-won, all of it theirs. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian asked. "About the day I found you. How different everything looked then." "Different how?" "Emptier. Harder. Like there was no point to any of it except just getting through to the next day." He turned to face her. "You changed that. Changed everything." "We changed it, together." She took his hand. "And we're going to keep changing it, keep building it, until this place is everything we want it to be." "And what do we want it to be?" Lillian smiled. "Ours. Completely, undeniably ours. A home we built from nothing that no one can take away from us. A place where we proved we could survive anything and came out stronger." "That's a good goal." "I think so." They stood there a moment longer, then went back to work on the chicken coop. There was always more work to be done on a homestead, always another project, another problem to solve. But for the first time since Elias had come to this land, the work felt like it meant something beyond simple survival. It felt like building a life. Spring arrived in fits and starts, warm days followed by cold snaps, the land slowly thawing and coming back to life. They planted the garden, working side by side to get everything in the ground before the optimal window closed. Lillian had plans for this garden. Not just food for them, but crops specifically chosen for their selling potential. Tomatoes, squash, beans, herbs for her preserves. "If this works the way I think it will," she said one evening, calculating costs and potential profits, "we could make enough to buy more cattle, real stock, breeding quality." "That's ambitious. That's the point. We're not just surviving anymore, remember? We're building." And build they did. Through spring and into summer, they expanded the homestead piece by piece. They bought 2 more heifers and a young bull with the money from Lillian's preserves. They repaired and improved the cabin, adding shelves and storage, making the space more functional. They built a proper smokehouse for preserving meat. They established relationships with people in town, becoming known for reliability and quality. By the time autumn rolled around again, a full year since Lillian had first arrived, the homestead was transformed. Still small by some standards, still rough around the edges, but undeniably theirs, and profitable enough to support them comfortably, with money left over to keep investing in improvements. One evening in late September, they sat outside watching the sunset, a familiar ritual now. "Do you ever think about him?" Elias asked. "Thomas Whitfield. What your life would have been like if he'd actually shown up?" Lillian considered the question. "Sometimes, but not the way you might think. I don't wonder if I made a mistake or if I'd be happier. I wonder if that version of me, the one who married him, would have ever figured out who she really was, what she was capable of." "You think you wouldn't have?" "I know I wouldn't have. I would have been Mrs. Thomas Whitfield, living in his big house, managing his household, always trying to measure up to whatever standard he and people like Margaret set. I would have spent my whole life being someone's wife instead of being myself." She looked at him. "Here, I'm Lillian Crow. Not because I married you, but because I chose to become her." I chose this life, this work, this partnership, and that makes all the difference. No regrets? Not a single one. You? Elias thought about the man he'd been a year ago. Isolated, guarded, convinced that being alone was safer than risking connection. That version of himself wouldn't recognize what his life had become. Shared space, shared goals, shared everything with someone who challenged him and supported him in equal measure. No regrets, he said. Except maybe that I didn't find you sooner. We found each other at exactly the right time. Any sooner, and I wouldn't have been ready. Any later, and she didn't finish the thought. They both knew what came later. The storm, the cold, the very real possibility that she wouldn't have survived another day alone. We got lucky, Elias said. We made our own luck. There's a difference. Lillian stood, stretched. Come on, let's go inside. I want to show you something. She led him into the cabin, to the chest where they kept important papers. She pulled out the marriage certificate Pike had filed, now officially recorded with the county, and beneath it was another document Elias hadn't seen before. What's that? Deed to the land. I had it transferred to both our names when I was in town last month. Figured if we're really partners, it should be official in every way that matters. She handed it to him. The homestead belongs to both of us now, legally, officially, forever. Elias looked at the document, saw both their names written there in careful script. Elias Crow and Lillian Crow, joint owners. Equal partners in every sense that mattered. You didn't have to do this, he said. Yes, I did, because that's what partnership means. Not one person owning everything and the other hoping to be taken care of. Both of us having equal stake, equal say, equal claim to what we build. She took his hand. This is our land now, our home, our life. Together. Elias pulled her into his arms, careful as always of old injuries that still twinged occasionally, and held her close. Together, he agreed. They stayed like that for a long moment, standing in the cabin they'd built and rebuilt, surrounded by the evidence of everything they'd survived and everything they'd created. Outside, the sun finished setting and darkness settled over the homestead. But inside, the fire burned warm and steady, pushing back the night. That winter was easier than the last, not because the weather was milder, if anything it was worse, but because they were better prepared, better equipped, better together. They'd learned from the previous year's mistakes, had systems in place for every contingency, knew exactly what they were facing and how to handle it. And when spring came again, they were ready to expand further. They hired their first help that summer, a young man named Jacob who was working his way west and needed temporary employment. He was green, knew almost nothing about homesteading, but he was willing to learn and strong enough to handle the heavy work Elias's ribs still occasionally protested. Reminds me of someone, Lillian said, watching Jacob struggle with the same tasks she'd struggled with 2 years earlier. Who? Me. When I first got here. Determined but clueless. You were never clueless, just inexperienced. Same thing. Not even close. Jacob stayed through the autumn, helped with the harvest, learned more in 4 months than most people learned in a year. When he left to continue west, he shook both their hands with genuine gratitude. You taught me more than just farming, he said. You taught me what partnership looks like, what building something real takes. I won't forget that. After he left, Lillian turned to Elias with a thoughtful expression. We should do that more. Hire people passing through, teach them what we know, pay it forward. That's a lot of work for not much return. Maybe, but someone stopped and helped me when I needed it. Seems right to do the same for others. So they did. Over the next few years, they became known as the place where drifters could find honest work and fair treatment. Not everyone who came through stayed long, but everyone who left took something with them, skills, knowledge, hope that there was still good in people. The homestead continued to grow. More land, more livestock, more infrastructure. They built a proper barn to replace the lean-to. They expanded the cabin again, adding a second room for the children Lillian sometimes talked about wanting someday. They established contracts with merchants in 3 different towns, Lillian's preserves becoming sought after enough that she could charge premium prices. 5 years after that first night in the storm, They hosted their first real celebration. A barn raising, actually, with neighbors coming from miles around to help build a structure that would finally hold all their equipment and livestock properly. It was a full day's work, followed by a dinner Lillian had been preparing for weeks. As the sun set and people began the long rides home, Elias stood with Lillian watching them go. "We have neighbors now," he said. "Real ones. People who know us, trust us, show up when we need help." "You sound surprised." "I am. Used to think I was better off alone. Turns out I was just scared." "Of what?" "Of this. Of having something to lose, of caring about people and places and things that could be taken away." He pulled her close. "But you taught me something important." "What's that?" "That the risk is worth it. That building something real with someone real, that's what makes life worth living. Not playing it safe, not protecting yourself from every possible hurt. Just choosing to be all in, even when it's scary." Lillian smiled. "Took you long enough to figure that out." "Better late than never." They stood there until the last wagon disappeared from view, then turned back to look at their homestead. The barn, solid and well-built. The cabin with its additions and improvements. The gardens, the livestock, the land stretching out in all directions. All of it hard-won through years of work and sweat and determination. But more than that, it was proof. Proof that two people who'd started with nothing could build something lasting. Proof that the worst circumstances could lead to the best outcomes if you were willing to fight for them. Proof that sometimes the storm that nearly destroys you brings exactly what you need to survive. "I never thanked you," Lillian said quietly. "For what?" "For stopping. That night in the storm. You could have ridden past, saved yourself the trouble. But you stopped. You took a chance on someone you didn't know, and you changed both our lives. You would have done the same." "Maybe. But you did it first. And everything that came after. Everything we built, everything we became. It started because you made that choice." She turned to face him fully. "So thank you. For stopping. For staying. For being the man I didn't know I needed until I found him." Elias didn't have words for what he felt in that moment. The gratitude and love and bone-deep certainty that this woman, this life, this partnership was exactly what he'd been missing without knowing it. So instead of words, he kissed her, long and slow and full of everything he couldn't say. When they finally pulled apart, Lillian was smiling. "Come on," she said. "Let's go inside. We've got plans to make." "What kind of plans?" "The kind that take years to accomplish. I want to expand the preserve business, maybe hire someone to help with production. And I've been thinking about those children we talked about. Might be time to start working on that project." "Might be," Elias agreed. They walked back to the cabin together, hands linked, the evening settling around them in comfortable familiarity. Behind them, the barn stood as testament to what they'd built. Ahead of them, the cabin glowed with warm light, promising shelter and safety and home. And between them, there was nothing but trust and partnership and the kind of love that got stronger with every challenge they faced together. The storm that had brought them together was long past, but what they'd built from it would last a lifetime. Years later, when people asked Lillian how she'd ended up on a homestead in the middle of Wyoming, married to a man she'd known less than a day before agreeing to stay, she'd smile and give them the simple version. She'd come west looking for a new start, things hadn't gone as planned, and she'd made the best of what she found. But the real story, the one she and Elias told each other on quiet evenings, the one they'd someday tell their children, that story was about more than just survival. It was about two people who'd both been abandoned by life in different ways, who'd found each other at exactly the moment they both needed saving. It was about choosing partnership over solitude, about building something real from absolutely nothing, about proving that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you brings the best thing you never knew to look for. It was about a woman in a wedding dress standing in a storm, and a man who stopped when he should have kept riding. It was about the life they built from that single choice. And it was, in every way that mattered, a love story. Not the kind that started with flowers and poetry and easy promises, but the kind that started with honesty and hard work and a shared determination to survive. The kind that got tested by storms and injury and all the brutal realities of frontier life and came out stronger every time. The kind that lasted. On Lillian's 50th birthday, Standing on the porch of the house they'd expanded 3 more times over the years, looking out at a homestead that had become one of the most successful in the territory, she turned to Elias with the same question she'd asked him that first night by the fire. No regrets? Elias, gray-haired now but still strong, still steady, still the man who'd stopped in a storm for a stranger, smiled and pulled her close. Not a single one. And that was the truth. They'd built something that no storm could destroy, something that belonged to them completely. A home, a life, a legacy. They'd started with nothing but a shared determination to survive the night. They'd built a future that would outlast them both. And in the end, that was more than either of them had dared to hope for when lightning first brought them together in the brutal Wyoming darkness all those years ago.